Catus, Maximus here. This is just a little comparison video. Both of these are American made, but we have the new ChannelLock 357 end cutters, or flush cut end nippers, and we have the slightly older number 357 ChannelLock flush cut end nippers. And I'm doing this video because they completely changed the design. These are the ones that they had, I think through the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s. And then in the 2000s, they switched to this design. This older style, of course, uses a flush rivet, has a pretty wide jaw, nicely kind of curved and smooth, rounded on each side, where the newer ones are really squared off. And then they don't use a flush rivet anymore. They just use a more of a standard protruding rivet. The other thing I was noticing is, I believe, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think the rivet's a little bit thicker on this unit than it is on this unit. Although I could be wrong because I can't take them apart and actually see. Of course, ChannelLock went with this really kind of dark carburized versus the old ones, which are ground. This is a cheaper to make tool because you're not involving all this grinding. This one's just forged out. They just grind a bit on the ends of the jaws, the sides of the jaws. One thing I was noticing about these jaws is this side's pretty sharp, but this side, if we just get it in the right light, which I'm trying to do here, you can see that it's actually kind of wide and flat. Where the old ones, they really focus on really having nice, sharp jaws on them. As you can see here, there's just a nice point on both sides of the jaws. Now, both of these have a little nick, but we can see that if I put it on this side, this is like a cotton cleaning string thing, a cleaning rope, that this will cut it pretty nicely. Now, if I use these, and I use the same area that's really nice on these, it still isn't quite as good. A couple little areas where it just doesn't quite want to fully cut through, and I think part of that's just because the jaws aren't quite as even. Now, the jaws are pretty good condition on these. If I open them up, there's just a tiny little booger right there. But I was just a little disappointed. You know, when you pick up these kind of tools used, all you do is you put them together, and then you put them up to the light, and you try to see if you can see any little pips of light coming through, and that's how you can really easily tell if the jaws are damaged. Another thing I was noticing is, if we look real closely at both these sets of jaws, you can see how these, where the actual cutting surfaces are a little further away than they are on these, meaning that this older style will actually cut flusher or closer to a surface than the newer 357s, and I kind of thought that was just a little bit disappointing. And basically, ChannelLocks are still made in America, but I believe they just cheapened out a little bit. They're just using a little bit smaller of a rivet, not as much grinding. If we look at the thickness of the handles here, you can see that this is just a little bit thinner on the newer ones than it is on the older ones. And I can really feel that. If you really squeeze hard here, the handles on the slightly older ones are much more rigid. Where these, you can see as I'm squeezing here, I'm really able to get actually a fair amount of springy flex. They just don't feel quite as rigid. They're just not quite as good a tool as they used to be. Also, if we compare the width, we get just a little bit more width out of the old ones. Another nice aspect of the old ones is the way that they have the curved side. So if you need to get right into something, maybe sideways, and do a cut, that you actually have this relief angle, so you can really get in there and do, use them like regular side cutters. Where these flat-sided ones, of course, cause a little bit more interference, so you can't get quite as into a flush surface and use them as side cutters, or they're not as effective for that purpose as these, which have a curved side. Anyway, that was the whole point to this little video. Of course, both of these still work great when you're just doing normal cutting, cutting things like paper clips. They both work absolutely fine. Although I think the jaws are still sharper. It was just a little bit less effort to make the very same cut comparing both of these. And I just kind of wanted to point that out, that even American-made channel locks are not quite the same as older American-made channel locks, and that's my little video. Anyway, really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Till next time, Catus Maximus out.